Okay, so I'm sitting at home yesterday afternoon, right? Just kind of lounging around after doing some errands, and I turn on ESPN because I want to catch up on what's happening around the league, and First Take is on. Normally, I might just have it on in the background while I'm doing other stuff, but something about the energy coming from the TV makes me actually stop and pay attention. Stephen A. Smith is already at the desk looking like he's about to explode with information he's been holding on to, and Mad Dog Russo is sitting across from him with this expression that says he has no idea what's about to come out of Stephen A.'s mouth, which honestly makes for the best television. Molly Karam introduces the segment by saying they're going to discuss some breaking news and developments around the NFL, specifically regarding coaching hires and potential quarterback situations, and I'm thinking, okay, this should be interesting. Hey, what's up everyone? Before we dive into everything I have for you today, I need to share something real with you that would mean the absolute world to me. That subscribe button right there. Hitting it right now would bring me one step closer to my dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers. I know you're eager to get into all this content, but real quick, just smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. It's such a simple thing. It takes literally 1 second, but it's honestly the biggest way you can support this journey and help me reach that milestone. Trust me, every single subscription gets me closer to that goal, and honestly, it would mean everything to me. So, do me that quick favor right now and be part of this dream becoming reality. Stephen A. jumps right into it without even warming up. He starts talking about how the Las Vegas Raiders just hired Clint Kubiak to be their next head coach, and how this is a significant move for an organization that's been searching for stability and direction for over 2 decades now. He's going on about how Kubiak is a young, innovative offensive mind, how he comes from an incredible coaching tree with his father, Gary Kubiak, being a Super Bowl-winning coach, and how he's had success developing quarterbacks like Sam Darnold in Seattle. Mad Dog is nodding along, saying, yeah, this is a smart hire for the Raiders. They needed someone who could come in and build an offense around the weapons they've drafted like Brock Bowers and Ashton Jeanty. But then, Stephen A. pivots to something completely unexpected, and this is where I literally put down my phone and give the TV my full attention. He says that according to multiple sources he's been speaking with around the league, the Raiders are not done making moves, and in fact, they're exploring the possibility of trading for a young quarterback who could be developed under Kubiak's system. Stephen A. pauses for dramatic effect, which he loves to do, and then he drops the name Anthony Richardson. I'm like, wait, what? Anthony Richardson from the Colts? The guy who's been so inconsistent and injury-prone that Indianapolis benched him for Joe Flacco at one point? That Anthony Richardson? But Stephen A. starts explaining the logic behind this, and I've got to say, the more he talks, the more sense it actually starts to make. He says the Raiders are in a unique position right now where they have the #1 overall pick in the upcoming draft. They've got over $100 million in salary cap space. They've got 10 total draft picks, and they've got a new head coach in Kubiak who's proven he can develop quarterbacks and get the most out of them. Stephen A. says the conventional wisdom is that the Raiders are going to take Fernando Mendoza with that #1 pick, and he's a great prospect, undefeated national champion, Heisman Trophy winner, all of that. But Stephen A. says, what if the Raiders are thinking bigger than that? What if they see an opportunity to get a quarterback with elite physical tools for a fraction of the cost it would take to draft one, and then they can use that #1 pick on a generational defensive player or trade it for a haul of assets? Mad Dog interrupts at this point, and he's got this incredulous look on his face. He says, Stephen A., are you seriously suggesting the Raiders should trade for Anthony Richardson instead of taking Fernando Mendoza? He says Richardson has been a disaster in Indianapolis. He can't stay healthy, he can't make consistent decisions, and he got benched for a 40-year-old Joe Flacco. Mad Dog says the Raiders have been a laughingstock for over 20 years now. They can't afford to take another risk on a quarterback who might not pan out. They need to take the sure thing in Mendoza and build around him. Stephen A. doesn't back down, though. He comes right back and says, Hold on, Mad Dog. Let me explain why this could actually be brilliant. He starts breaking down Richardson's physical tools, talking about how he's got one of the strongest arms in the NFL, how he's a legitimate dual threat who can run like a running back when he takes off, and how he's only 22 years old with all the upside in the world. Stephen A. says the problem with Richardson in Indianapolis wasn't necessarily Richardson himself. It was the situation he was in. He was drafted by a team that was trying to win now. They didn't have the patience to let him develop. They threw him into the fire too early, and when he struggled, they benched him instead of working through the growing pains with him. He continues by saying that if you put Richardson in a completely different situation, like with the Raiders where they're rebuilding, where they have a new head coach who specializes in developing quarterbacks, where they have weapons like Brock Bowers and Ashton Genty, who can make his life easier, and where there's no immediate pressure to win right away, Richardson could flourish. Stephen A. says Clint Kubiak has turned Sam Darnold into a 14-game winner in Seattle. He helped Kirk Cousins have 3 straight years with a passer rating over 100. He was the pass game coordinator for Brock Purdy's best season, and he even got production out of Derek Carr when he was in New Orleans. Stephen A. says if Kubiak can do all of that with those quarterbacks, imagine what he could do with a guy who has Richardson's physical gifts. Molly jumps in at this point and asks a really important question, which is why would the Colts even be willing to trade Richardson? Stephen A. has an answer ready. He says the Colts are in a tough spot because they invested a top 5 pick in Richardson, and it hasn't worked out the way they hoped. He says there are real questions in Indianapolis about whether Richardson is mature enough, whether he's dedicated enough, whether he can stay healthy, and whether he's ever going to put it all together. Stephen A. says the Colts might be looking at the situation and thinking maybe a fresh start would be good for both sides. Maybe Richardson needs a different environment to succeed, and maybe they can recoup some value for him while they still can before his stock drops even further. Mad Dog is still skeptical, but he's starting to engage with the idea more seriously now. He asks what the Raiders would have to give up to get Richardson, because even though Richardson hasn't lived up to expectations, he's still a former top 5 pick on a rookie contract with elite physical tools. Stephen A. says he thinks the Raiders could probably get Richardson for a second-round pick and maybe a young player who hasn't panned out for them. He says the Colts aren't going to get back what they originally invested in Richardson, but they'd probably be happy to get something of value and move on to a different quarterback. Stephen A. then starts talking about how this would fit into the Raiders' overall strategy. And this is where the discussion gets really interesting from a team-building perspective. He says if the Raiders trade for Richardson, they don't have to take a quarterback with the number 1 overall pick. That means they can take someone like James Pierce Jr. or Abdul Carter, or another elite defensive player who can anchor their defense for the next decade. Or they can trade that pick to a team that's desperate for a quarterback and get back multiple first-round picks and other assets that they can use to build out their roster. Stephen A. says the Raiders have been bad for so long because they've made impatient decisions, they've tried to win now when they weren't ready, and they've mortgaged their future for short-term gains. He says if they're smart about this, they can set themselves up for sustained success by accumulating assets and developing young talent. Mad Dog brings up the injury concerns with Richardson, and this is definitely a legitimate issue that can't be ignored. He talks about how Richardson has missed significant time in both of his NFL seasons, how he takes a lot of unnecessary hits because of his style of play, and how there are real questions about whether his body can hold up to playing quarterback in the NFL. Mad Dog says the last thing the Raiders need is to trade for a quarterback who's going to spend half the season on injured reserve. Stephen A. acknowledges this concern but says Richardson is young enough that maybe with better coaching and a system that protects him better, he won't have to take as many hits. He says part of Richardson's injury problems in Indianapolis came from the fact that he felt like he had to do too much. He was trying to make plays happen with his legs because the passing game wasn't working. But if you put him in an offense with better weapons and better scheme, he won't feel that same pressure. The conversation shifts to talking about what Clint Kubiak's offense could look like with Anthony Richardson at quarterback. And both Stephen A. and Mad Dog get really detailed about the X's and O's here. Stephen A. talks about how Kubiak comes from the Shanahan coaching tree, which emphasizes zone-running schemes, play-action passing, and getting receivers open through scheme rather than just relying on them to beat their man. He says Richardson's arm strength would be perfect for the deep shots off play-action that are staples of that offensive system. Stephen A. also mentions that Kubiak has shown he can scheme up open receivers consistently, pointing to what he did with Jackson Smith-Njigba in Seattle. And that would help Richardson tremendously because one of his biggest issues has been forcing throws into tight coverage instead of taking what the defense gives him. Mad Dog adds that the zone running game would also benefit Richardson because it would take pressure off him to pass on every down. He says if you can establish the run with Ashton Jeanty, who's a dynamic talent, then you're setting up play action and keeping defenses honest. Mad Dog says Richardson's mobility would also be a huge asset in the zone running game because you can run zone read concepts and RPOs that put stress on the defense's edges. He says the problem with Richardson in Indianapolis was that they were asking him to be a pocket passer and make complex reads. If you simplify things for him and let him use his athleticism, he could be really effective. Stephen A. brings up a comparison that I thought was really interesting. He says Richardson reminds him a little bit of Josh Allen when Allen first came into the league. He says Allen was raw, he was inconsistent, he had accuracy issues, but the Bills believed in his physical tools, and they built a system around him and worked with him to develop his weaknesses. And now, he's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Stephen A. says, obviously, there's no guarantee that Richardson follows that same path, but the blueprint is there for how you can take a quarterback with elite physical gifts and turn him into a star with the right coaching and patience. Mad Dog pushes back on this comparison a bit. He says the difference is that Josh Allen always showed mental toughness and work ethic even when he was struggling, whereas there have been questions about Richardson's dedication and maturity. Mad Dog mentions that there were reports during the season that Richardson wasn't putting in the work in the film room, that he wasn't taking practice seriously enough, and those are red flags that you can't ignore. Stephen A. says that's fair, but sometimes a change of scenery can change a player's mindset. He says, maybe Richardson needs to go to a new organization. Maybe he needs to hit rock bottom and realize that if he doesn't turn things around, his career is going to be over before it really started. And maybe that's the wake-up call he needs. Molly asks them to talk about how Fernando Mendoza factors into all of this, because we can't forget that everyone expects the Raiders to take him with the #1 pick. Stephen A. says Mendoza is a great prospect. He's a winner. He's got all the intangibles you want in a quarterback, but he's also not the most physically gifted guy. He says Mendoza is probably going to be a solid NFL quarterback who can manage a game and not lose it for you, but he's probably not going to be a guy who can take over games with his arm and carry your team when things break down. Stephen A. says, if you're the Raiders and you're thinking long-term, maybe you'd rather have a quarterback with Richardson's upside, even if he's riskier, and then you can use that #1 pick on a player at another position who can help you more immediately. Mad Dog disagrees with this assessment of Mendoza. He says Mendoza might not have the cannon arm that Richardson has, but he's got accuracy, he's got football IQ, he's got leadership, and those things matter just as much as physical tool. Mad Dog says the Raiders have tried the project quarterback thing before, with guys who had all the physical ability in the world, but couldn't put it together mentally, and it never works out. He says, sometimes the smart play is to take the guy who, can play the position at a competent level, rather than swinging for the fences on a guy who might completely bust. The debate continues, and Stephen A. brings up the financial aspect of potentially trading for Richardson versus drafting Mendoza. He says Richardson is still on his rookie contract, and even though he was a top 5 pick, so his salary is higher than if you drafted someone at #1 overall, you're still getting a quarterback on a relatively cheap deal. Stephen A. says this gives the Raiders flexibility to spend money in free agency on other positions, to extend Brock Bowers when his rookie deal is up, to pay Ashton Jeanty down the line, all of that. Mad Dog counters by saying, but if Richardson doesn't work out, you've wasted all that cap space and you still don't have a franchise quarterback. Whereas if you draft Mendoza, at least you know exactly what you're getting into from the beginning. They also spend some time discussing what Tom Brady's role in all of this might be. Stephen A. mentions that Tom Brady is part owner of the Raiders now, and he apparently really connected with Clint Kubiak during the interview process because they were just football guys talking football. Stephen A. says Brady is obviously one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, and if he's in the building working with whoever the Raiders quarterback ends up being, that's a huge advantage. He says maybe Brady looks at Richardson and sees something that can be developed, sees a player who, with the right coaching and mentorship, could turn into something special. Mad Dog says that's possible, but he could also see Brady looking at Richardson and thinking, this guy doesn't have the dedication and work ethic that it takes to be great at this level, and if that's the case, Brady would probably advocate for taking Mendoza instead. Molly asks them to make predictions about what they think the Raiders are actually going to do, and this is where things get interesting because you can tell both of them have strong opinions. Stephen A. says, if he had to guess, he thinks the Raiders are seriously considering the Richardson option, but he thinks ultimately they're going to play it safe and take Mendoza with the first pick. He says the Raiders have been burned too many times making risky decisions, and even though Richardson could be a home run, the safer play is to take the guy everyone expects them to take and build around him. Mad Dog agrees and says, yeah, I think they end up with Mendoza, but he says if they did trade for Richardson, he wouldn't be completely shocked because the Raiders have a history of making moves that surprise people. Stephen A. then pivots to talking about how this all fits into the bigger picture of the Raiders' rebuild. He says the Raiders have been irrelevant for over 20 years now, they haven't won a playoff game since 2002, and they've been through more coaches and quarterbacks than almost any team in the league during that span. He says the hiring of Clint Kubiak feels like finally they're making a smart decision. Finally they're thinking long-term and trying to build something sustainable rather than just throwing darts at the wall and hoping something works. Stephen A. says whether they end up with Richardson or Mendoza or someone else at quarterback, the key is going to be giving Kubiak the time and resources to implement his system and develop his player. Mad Dog adds that the Raiders have all the pieces in place to be successful if they're patient. He talks about how they have Brock Bowers, who's already one of the best tight ends in the league as a rookie. They have Ashton Jeanty, who can be a foundational running back. They have Max Crosby, who's an elite pass rusher. And they have a ton of draft capital and cap space to add more talent. Mad Dog says the biggest mistake they could make would be to rush things and try to win immediately, because they're not ready for that yet. He says if they take the next 2 or 3 years to build the roster the right way, to develop their young players, to create a winning culture, then they could be legitimate contenders by 2028 or 2029. Stephen A. says he loves what he's seeing from the Raiders' decision-making process right now. He talks about how they interviewed multiple candidates for the head coaching position, how they landed on Kubiak, who feels like the perfect fit for where they are as an organization, and how they seem to be thinking strategically about every move they make. Stephen A. says if they can maintain that level of thoughtfulness and discipline, they have a real chance to turn things around. He says the AFC West is wide open right now with Kansas City getting older, with Denver and LA still trying to figure things out, and the Raiders have an opportunity to position themselves as the team of the future in that division. The conversation winds down, and Molly asks them for their final thoughts on whether the Anthony Richardson to the Raiders thing is real or just speculation. Stephen A. says he thinks it's real in the sense that the Raiders have at least discussed it internally and done their homework on Richardson, but whether they actually pull the trigger is a different question. He says it would be a bold move, it would be a risky move, but it could also be a move that pays off in a huge way if Richardson develops into the player his physical tools suggest he could be. Mad Dog says he thinks it's mostly speculation. He thinks the Raiders are going to end up taking Mendoza, or possibly even trading down from the #1 pick if they get an offer they can't refuse. But he says if they do trade for Richardson, he'll be interested to see how it plays out. They wrap up the segment by saying they'll continue following this story as the offseason progresses and as we get closer to the draft. Molly thanks them both for the discussion, and the show goes to commercial. I'm sitting there on my couch, just trying to process everything I just heard. Anthony Richardson to the Raiders was not on my bingo card for this offseason, but after listening to Stephen A. and Mad Dog debate it for half an hour, I can actually see the logic in it. The Raiders are in a position where they can afford to take a swing on a high-upside player like Richardson, especially if they can get him without giving up significant assets. Clint Kubiak has proven he can develop quarterbacks and get the most out of them, and if anyone can fix Richardson's inconsistencies and help him reach his potential, it's probably Kubiak. The thing that really resonated with me from the whole segment was Stephen A.'s point about thinking long-term and not being afraid to take calculated risks. The Raiders have been playing it safe for years, and it hasn't worked out for them. They're still one of the worst teams in the league. Maybe it's time to try a different approach, to take a chance on a player with elite physical tools and see if you can develop him into something special. Richardson might not work out. He might end up being another bust. But if he does work out, he could be a franchise-changing player who elevates the entire organization. I'm definitely going to be paying close attention to what the Raiders do this offseason. The Kubiak hiring feels like a step in the right direction, and if they can nail their decisions at quarterback, and with the rest of their draft picks, they could be on their way to finally turning things around after decades of losing. Whether that quarterback ends up being Anthony Richardson or Fernando Mendoza or someone else entirely, it's going to be fascinating to watch it all unfold. The Raiders have been irrelevant for so long that it's easy to forget they used to be one of the most iconic franchises in all of sports. Maybe this is the beginning of them reclaiming that status.